A change from the Trump administration that takes effect today requires hospitals to stop sending their coronavirus data to the CDC and instead send it to the administration. So we're going to bring in Weijia Jiang to talk a little bit about this change. Weijia, what do we know about, what this means? Where's that information going? And sort of what's the overall concern?
So it means that thousands and thousands of hospitals across the country are now going to be sending their data to the Department of HHS, which is here in Washington, Health and Human Services, instead of the CDC, which really relies on this data to come up with guidelines and to tell Americans how they should behave to protect themselves based on this information. And HHS is saying, look, it's because the CDC is not reporting it is quick enough for what the country needs to keep up with the trends and understanding what's happening with the virus, because it's an old system and they've already shown that they have about a week lag, and that's why HHS will now take over. But critics were very quick to say that this is just another attempt by the administration and President Trump to politicize science, because more and more you're seeing that the CDC is almost being pushed out of the way here, when typically during a pandemic like this, it would have the leading role. This is just the latest of several steps we've seen. For example, most recently on schools, the president came out and said that the CDC's guidelines about reopening were too tough and that he wanted new measures. When it came to reopening more in general, too, you'll remember a couple months ago, he said the same thing, which was that, the guidelines were too prescriptive. He wanted something simpler. And, health experts are saying this is not the time to keep things simple, that these scientists at the CDC are using their expertise to make conclusions and recommendations for people at a time that we need to be as specific as possible so we can try to get control of this virus.
Weijia, let me ask you about White House trade advisor Peter Navarro and his op-ed criticizing Dr. Anthony Fauci's guidance. He wrote in this op-ed, quote, "When you ask me whether I listen to Dr. Fauci's advice, my answer is only with skepticism and caution." I will also note that, as you have in your reporting, Weijia, the president over the last couple of days has retweeted the former host of Love Connection, who says, quote, "Everyone is lying," in a tweet. He retweeted a cartoon that was disparaging of Dr. Anthony Fauci. Can you explain what your experience covering the White House has been with regards to the information that comes from the White House to the press corps with regards to Dr. Fauci? And how is the White House responding to this Navarro op-ed?
So the White House says that Peter Navarro went rogue, that he did not follow the normal channels that are typically required to publish an op-ed by a White House official, that he was supposed to go to them, have a meeting, and say, look, this is what I want to write. What do you think? At least give them a heads up that it was coming. And they claim that even that never happened. And in fact, we're extremely surprised, sources tell me here, because they had just had a conversation with Peter Navarro about tamping down his public attacks on Anthony Fauci. In fact, we should note that almost word for word what he wrote in this USA Today op-ed, he sent to CBS News on Sunday. So we weren't necessarily surprised because he gave it to us on the record. But the comms team says the point here is that he did what he wanted to do and didn't consult with them. But, you have to wonder why he would do that, why he would have the confidence and assurance to do that, and whether somebody else gave him the green light. And so we asked whether President Trump signed off on this or even asked him to do it, and have not gotten an answer to that question yet, with the press team just saying, we're not going to talk about what other officials in the building might have known about it. We're just saying we didn't. This is kind of problematic because an official, Dan Scavino, who is an official in the comms department, a deputy chief, himself is posting on Facebook, which we talked about yesterday, a really disparaging cartoon about Dr. Fauci. So on the one hand, they're saying, we told Peter Navarro to cool it because we don't want the Fauci feud to continue. On the other hand, one of their own team members is doing just that. And so for the bigger picture, they claim that they want to move on because they don't want all the oxygen to be sucked out by this ongoing tension between the White House and Dr. Fauci. But, if there are no repercussions, for example, for what Peter Navarro has done, it doesn't really send that message.
Can we talk a little bit about President Trump's remarks in the Rose Garden yesterday? I dipped in when he was talking about Hong Kong and China and Hong Kong's new security law that they've been, China's new security law that they've imposed on Hong Kong, and how the U.S. was reacting to that. And then it sort of very quickly pivoted to criticizing Joe Biden, and it started to take on the feel of a campaign speech. He's being criticized for that. And some people may say, the president can call a press conference and he can talk about whatever he wants. But can we talk a little bit about typically what takes place, historically what has taken place in the Rose Garden, why the media was called to the Rose Garden, and what happened?
Sure. So the Rose Garden is quite lovely, actually, and it's usually used when the president is going to make a formal announcement or sign something, which happened yesterday. You were right in that he did sign an executive order and made an announcement on China about sanctions. But then this pivot is what people are criticizing because, as you mentioned, it really did feel like a campaign rally. And I can tell you that, for 63 minutes, after about 15 minutes, when it became increasingly clear what this was, members of the press, we were all looking around like, is this happening right now? Because it just spiraled into something we are all very familiar with, which is a campaign rally, because we've gone across the country and covered them. And so he kept going and attacking former Vice President Joe Biden, and actually, went through a list of things that Biden is proposing on his agenda and attacked each one. And it just seemed odd because of what is happening in the country. The president did not talk at length about the coronavirus. He did not talk about, the fact that he had just made news with CBS's Catherine Herridge about race relations. And, these are the two things that are really staring him down and that he is seemingly ignoring because, again, this was a great opportunity for him, calling a press conference, something he hasn't done in quite a while, to answer the mounting questions that we have. But instead, he turned it into what felt like a bit of a spectacle, because it was not the proper place for him to air so many grievances all at once.
Yeah, and as you point out, Weijia, the Rose Garden at this particular moment in time where we are in history would have been an opportune time to address the more than 130,000 people in this country who have perished because of this pandemic, and to provide some kind of solace, some kind of comfort perhaps, and to perhaps even offer strategy on ways to mitigate the mounting number of infections we see across the country. And the president didn't do that. As you say, he talked about China, he talked about energy taxes, he talked about the European Union, his friendship with Mexico's president, Chicago crime. He said Joe Biden had gone more right, which nobody understood what that meant. He said Joe Biden would abolish the suburbs, which nobody understood what that meant. And so are you hearing from the White House, as the president prepares to travel to Georgia today, that they are anywhere closer to providing any kind of a strategy with regards to where we are with the pandemic?
Well, they would argue that they've already made that strategy very clear, and that the vice president continues to have briefings and meetings with the task force. But it is becoming increasingly muddled, I would say, because the president himself is not taking it on. He did mention the coronavirus and the number of deaths, but he framed it in a way that was praising himself for everything he has done, saying that if it weren't for him and all the steps he took early on in the pandemic, the death rate would be much higher. And so he did talk about it in that way. But he seems almost unwilling to acknowledge the fact that it is spreading continuously and that every day the death rate is going up. And so I think that, sources have said the president is in charge when it comes to messaging, although he has agreed to tamp it down a little bit, because you'll remember he was having these briefings almost every day. But ultimately, he will decide what he says and when he says it. In fact, yesterday he said he was going to be having more news conferences. And so we have to see if that actually happens. But, for his trip today to Atlanta, it's another great example, because Atlanta is a hotspot, and he's not going down there to talk about the virus. He's going to talk about infrastructure and rolling back environmental regulations to make projects easier, not only there, but across the country. He's only going to be there for about an hour and a half. And so it's almost like people are begging for more information if you're going to an area that is devastated by the virus to talk about it, but that's just not his plan right now.
All right, Weijia Jiang for us at the White House. Weijia, as always, we thank you.
Sure.